The moment I stepped into the ceremony hall that afternoon, I realized something was terribly wrong because the seats reserved for my family remained completely empty despite the 2-month notice I had given them. My name is Cassandra, and I never imagined that my wedding day would begin with the kind of silence that can split a person open. I kept trying to ignore the truth forming in front of me. Yet, it became impossible once my phone buzzed with a message claiming the baseball game airing that day could not be replayed, as if that single excuse outweighed every promise they had made. I stared at the screen long enough to feel my stomach twist, then sent them a list of 10 sports channels capable of replaying that exact game to show that their explanation had no real weight. Their replies came quickly filled with short sentences that sounded more like obligations than genuine regret, which finally made me understand that their absence had never been accidental. Later that night, after the last guest had gone home, I gathered every bit of courage left in me and wrote a long post on Facebook detailing the truth about what my family chose to do on my wedding day. I pressed share with trembling hands, unaware of what the next morning would bring. In that moment, I decided to block every one of them. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I needed to stop handing out pieces of myself to people who never planned to show up for me in the first place. I still had to stand there, smile, and pretend nothing was falling apart while my husband held my hands tightly enough to steady my breathing. Before I take you through everything that led to this moment, I hope you stay with me and follow this story to the end, because nothing about what happened next was simple. When I look back on the moment I sent the wedding invitations to my family, I realized that their distance had already been forming long before the date of my ceremony was even set. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with a stack of envelopes and feeling a small burst of hope because I believed that the invitations would create a sense of unity that had slowly faded over the years. My optimism lasted only until the first few replies came in, and each response felt like a reminder of how unfamiliar closeness had become in my family. My parents have always been the kind of people who place their personal interests above many of the significant moments that should have brought us together. And although I spent years pretending this trait did not affect me, adulthood made the truth much harder to ignore. Mom often filled her days with hobbies and routines that left little room for anything she did not personally prioritize. While Dad moved through life with an ease that suggested emotional obligations were optional rather than essential, they rarely came to events unless it suited their schedules. And I spent a long time convincing myself that behavior like this was normal for parents who valued independence. That belief started cracking the moment they received my wedding invitations, because the tone of their responses suggested little enthusiasm for something that mattered deeply to me. I introduced the invitations to them gently by explaining how meaningful the ceremony would be, and I expected at least a small sign of warmth. Instead, I received short messages that sounded strangely detached, filled with phrases like, "We will see if we can make it, or we will try to be there depending on how things look around that time." Those sentences were not openly dismissive, yet they carried a distance that made my chest feel tight. They did not ask me anything about the preparations or how I was feeling, and they offered no sense of excitement, which left me wondering whether my wedding represented anything significant to them at all. I kept rereading their messages despite knowing that doing so would only deepen the discomfort building inside me. My sister Sabrina reacted in a way that aligned with the emotional gap that had existed between us for many years. She and I grew up under the same roof. Yet, we never developed the kind of connection I had always imagined sisters shared because Sabrina avoided personal conversations and never let anyone get close enough to see her vulnerabilities. When I told her about my engagement, she offered a polite congratulation without any follow-up questions. And when I gave her the invitation, she glanced at it as if it were an obligation that had appeared on her desk. Her message came later that evening, and although she said she would try to be present, the wording made it clear that my wedding did not sit anywhere near the center of her priorities. Her distance carried a familiar heaviness that settled into my chest and stayed there for days. As the weeks passed, I attempted to create opportunities to reconnect with everyone because I wanted the wedding to be something that softened old tensions rather than strengthened them. I reached out with updates about the preparations, hoping to spark more engagement. Yet, every response felt colder than the last. The messages I received were short and vague, often written in a tone that implied I was intruding on their time rather than inviting them into a milestone of my life. I tried arranging small gatherings in hopes of bridging the emotional gap, but each suggestion was met with excuses about scheduling conflicts, commitments with friends, or general disinterest. The contrast between my efforts and their passivity created a sense of disappointment that grew heavier as the wedding date approached. I wanted them to share my excitement, or at least offer a hint of support, but instead I was left with replies that made it difficult to believe they saw the day as something important. Their behavior revealed a pattern I had ignored for years, a pattern in which their personal circles and private interests held more weight than any attempt I made to draw them closer. Realizing this was painful, yet acknowledging it helped me understand that the distance between us was not sudden. It had been forming quietly over time, even if I had refused to see it. Despite everything, I still held on to the small hope that the wedding would be the moment they chose to show up for me. And that belief kept me moving forward with preparations, even when the emotional silence felt overwhelming. I convinced myself that their cold responses did not necessarily guarantee their absence, because people sometimes behave differently when an important day finally arrived. I told myself that maybe seeing me walk down the aisle would remind them of the bond we shared, and perhaps they would push aside their personal preferences long enough to celebrate with me. That fragile hope stayed with me, even as the evidence suggested otherwise. 3 weeks before the wedding, I began noticing that every conversation in our family group chat somehow drifted away from anything related to my ceremony and circled back to the upcoming baseball playoff that everyone seemed determined to celebrate. At first, I believed it was merely a temporary distraction caused by the excitement that surrounded major games in our region. Yet, the pattern remained long enough for me to understand that something deeper was taking shape beneath the surface. Each morning I opened my phone hoping for at least a single message acknowledging the preparations I had been working so hard on. But the chat showed nothing other than lengthy threads about predictions, statistics, and arguments over which team deserved to win. The constant presence of those messages created a sense of distance that did not seem accidental. Sabrina fueled the momentum of those conversations with an enthusiasm I rarely saw directed toward me, and her posts reflected a level of excitement that felt strangely personal despite having nothing to do with my life. She uploaded daily countdowns to the playoff, complete with emojis and commentary that filled the chat with noise that overshadowed everything else. She described her plans for a viewing party, asked others for recommendations on snacks, and even joked about clearing her entire weekend schedule so she could fully commit to the experience. Reading those messages made something sink inside me because her energy highlighted the absence of any interest in the event that was supposed to matter to all of us. I kept scrolling through her updates in an attempt to find a single sentence that hinted at support for my wedding. Yet nothing came close to that. Mom eventually responded to a reminder I sent about the ceremony, though her message did not provide comfort or reassurance. She wrote that she would see how things line up and that she hoped the timing would work out somehow, which sounded like a vague attempt to avoid making any actual commitment. The tone of her words felt cautious rather than caring, and I sensed that the wedding had already been pushed down her list of priorities. I reread her message several times to understand why it felt so distant, and the answer appeared in the form of a new thread. She started minutes later where she asked everyone whether the playoff coverage would be aired on multiple channels. Her sudden shift from my wedding to the game created a weight inside my chest that stayed with me for the rest of the day. Dad behaved in a way that solidified the growing fear that my family had begun placing the playoff above everything else. He joined the conversation shortly after Mom's messages and launched into a detailed explanation of what he believed the team needed to adjust in order to secure their victory. His analysis stretched across several long paragraphs filled with references to past seasons, coaching decisions, and performance comparisons. None of his messages contained even a hint that he had read anything I had written about the ceremony, and he did not ask a single question about the event. His priorities had become obvious enough for me to understand that he was mentally preparing for the game rather than preparing to attend my wedding. During those weeks, the emotional pressure grew steadily because every indication pointed toward a possibility I had been trying to avoid since the first lukewarm responses in the previous months. The discomfort became so noticeable that my best friend Elena reached out to me after noticing that I had stopped sharing updates as frequently as before. She called me late one evening to ask whether everything was all right, and her voice carried enough warmth to break through the heaviness I had been holding inside. I told her about the messages filling the group chat and described the disappointment that had been building with each passing day. Ella Nina listened without interruption, allowing me to breathe through the frustration that had settled over me. And she reminded me that not every family knows how to support the people they should care about most. Her presence in that moment helped me stay grounded, even though I knew the underlying fear remained unresolved. As each day passed, the anxiety slowly turned into something more difficult to name because the silence surrounding my wedding grew louder than the conversation surrounding the playoff. Every attempt I made to steer the discussion toward the ceremony disappeared among the rapid messages about game strategies, team history, and predictions for the final score. I kept hoping someone would break the pattern and show even the slightest interest in my life. Yet, the group chat only grew more focused on the upcoming game, as if nothing else deserved their attention. The shift was so unmistakable that it became clear I was watching my family drift toward a decision they had no intention of acknowledging aloud. The tension created by their behavior shaped the atmosphere of those weeks leading up to the wedding, and the imbalance between my efforts and their enthusiasm forced me to confront a reality I had tried to avoid. I wanted to believe they would set aside the playoff for one day, but the conversations in the chat suggested that hope might not survive much longer. Every message they sent felt like a small confirmation that I was standing alone in a space that should have been filled with support, and the uneasiness grew until it became impossible to ignore. On the morning of my wedding, I held my phone with a fragile kind of hope that Mom or Dad would send even a brief message. Yet the screen stayed silent in a way that felt heavier than I expected. I kept telling myself that the quiet might simply mean they were getting ready, or that they wanted to surprise me later, but I knew those explanations were nothing more than soft excuses designed to protect a heart that was already tired. I tried to breathe steadily while preparing for the ceremony, and although the mirror reflected a composed version of myself, the truth behind my eyes was far less stable than I wished it to be. The morning moved slowly, as if time itself wanted me to notice every detail of what was happening and what was not happening, and that realization became a quiet weight on my chest. When I arrived at the venue, I walked toward the rows of chairs with a practiced calmness that felt unfamiliar. I had imagined this moment many times, including the warmth of seeing my family sitting together near the front. Instead, I was met with the unmistakable emptiness of an entire section that had been reserved specifically for them. The sight hit me harder than I expected because it confirmed something I had been avoiding for weeks. They had chosen their priorities long before this morning, and their decision had already been made. I stood still for a moment, absorbing a truth that did not ask for permission before settling into me. A notification vibrated in my hand, and I looked at my phone instinctively, hoping for even the simplest acknowledgement. Instead, I saw a new story posted by Sabrina. She was at a crowded sports bar in Tulsa, cheering loudly while holding a drink with both hands surrounded by people wearing matching jerseys. Her caption celebrated a moment in the game that apparently mattered far more to her than witnessing me walk toward a new chapter of my life. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, trying to understand how someone who shared my childhood could offer so much. Enthusiasm for a game, yet none for a sister's wedding. The contrast stung with a sharpness I had not prepared for. When I put my phone away, my husband Ethan approached me with a gentle awareness that made my chest tighten. I introduced him earlier in the planning timeline, but standing there on the actual day made his support feel even more grounding. He noticed the slight tremor in my fingers despite my attempts to hide it, and he placed his hand over mine with a steady warmth that helped me reclaim my breath. Ethan did not ask questions or offer empty reassurances because he understood that some disappointments needed silence instead of solutions. His presence alone reminded me that I was not entering this new life alone, even if the people who raised me had decided not to show up for the moment. As the ceremony began, I became acutely aware of the glances directed toward the empty chairs. Guests were too polite to say anything, yet their confusion lingered in the air. I understood what they were thinking because I had asked myself the same questions repeatedly. Parents usually make an effort to attend weddings unless something unexpected or unavoidable keeps them away. In my case, there was no emergency, no accident, no urgent obligation. There was only a deliberate choice made in favor of entertainment rather than presence. And that knowledge pressed against me each time I lifted my eyes toward that vacant row. Despite the heaviness wrapped around my thoughts, I continued with the ceremony. Ethan guided me through each step with a calm strength that I relied on more than I admitted. My friends, who had stood by me throughout the planning process, offered their own quiet support with brief touches and encouraging smiles. They never tried to replace what I had lost, but they helped soften the sharpest edges of the disappointment. I focused on their efforts instead of the silence that continued to follow me like a shadow, and doing so allowed me to keep moving forward. When the minister announced the transition into our vows, I finally accepted that my family's absence was not caused by an unforeseen obstacle. It was simply the result of a choice they had made long before this day arrived. That understanding settled inside me with a finality that felt both painful and clarifying. I completed the ceremony with a heart heavier than I anticipated. Yet there was an unexpected steadiness rising beneath the grief. Their absence had revealed more truth than their presence ever could, and acknowledging that truth became the quiet closing note of the morning. When the last guest stepped out of the hall and the lights faded into a muted glow, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge the hollow space left behind by my family's absence, and that quiet pushed me toward a decision I had been delaying for hours. I reached for my phone with hands that still carried the weight of the ceremony, unsure of what I expected to gain from a conversation that had already disappointed me in more ways than I could count. The room around me felt calmer than it had all day, and that calmness gave me the clarity I needed to ask the question that had been buried beneath each step of the wedding march. I typed a message to Mom, Dad, and Sabrina, asking them directly why they had not attended the one event I had hoped they would choose to show up for. Mom replied first, and her answer carried a tone that made the silence from earlier feel kinder than the words now appearing on my screen. She wrote that the game had not been replayable, phrasing it as though that simple fact could stand in for a genuine explanation. Her message lacked hesitation, apology, or any awareness of the pain those words created. It read as if she believed the inconvenience of missing a sports broadcast could justify the deeper damage of abandoning a daughter on a day meant to symbolize unity. I stared at her response with a disbelief that settled slowly into resignation. Sabrina's message arrived only moments later, and its coldness removed any lingering doubt about her intentions. She wrote, "You picked a bad day," with a bluntness that felt almost rehearsed. There was no hint of regret or recognition of the significance of the moment she had chosen to skip. Her words suggested that my wedding had been an unfortunate interruption rather than a milestone worth celebrating. The distance in her tone made it clear that she had not even considered the emotional weight carried by her absence. Her loyalty belonged fully to the energy of the sports bar she had chosen over me. Dad responded last, and his message was the shortest, but somehow the most telling. He wrote, "We already made plans, as if a simple schedule conflict could erase the meaning of parental presence." His response confirmed what I had sensed throughout the weeks leading up to the wedding. He had never intended to attend. He had never imagined himself standing among the people who supported me today. The thought of seeing me walk down the aisle had not mattered enough for him to reconsider a casual outing. His priorities were sealed long before my invitation reached him. Each message settled over me like a different layer of clarity, and that clarity sharpened the realization that their excuses did not reflect sudden circumstances, but rather long-standing choices. I gathered my breath and sent them a list of 10 sports networks offering full replay functions for the exact game they insisted could not be watched. Afterward, my message was measured, but it carried the strength I had been afraid to use in past conversations. I wanted them to understand that their explanations were not only careless but objectively false. Their decision had come from preference, not necessity, and I refused to let their words rewrite the truth. After sending the message, I opened the notes I had been writing quietly for weeks. I transformed those paragraphs into a single long post for my social media page. I explained what had happened, not with anger, but with an honesty that finally felt permitted. I wrote about the months of planning the empty row at the front of the venue, the silence of the morning, and the excuses that followed. I stated clearly that my family had chosen entertainment over presence, and I allowed myself to acknowledge how deeply that hurt me. The post did not aim to punish them. It aimed to free me from the weight of pretending. When I finished writing, I read it twice to ensure that every sentence reflected the truth without slipping into cruelty or exaggeration. My voice remained steady throughout the entire piece. For the first time in years, I felt like I was speaking without waiting for their approval. I pressed post, placed my phone on the nightstand, and turned it face down. I knew the notifications would begin soon, but I needed to step away from all of it. That night, I turned off the lights, lay beside Ethan, and let exhaustion replace the tension that had been holding me upright since morning. I fell asleep with the quiet understanding that I had finally said what I had kept inside for far too long. The next morning, when sunlight slipped through the curtains, and I finally turned my phone back on, I realized my post had traveled far beyond anything I had imagined, reaching corners of the online community in Tulsa that I had never interacted with before. Notifications flooded the screen so quickly that the device froze for several seconds, and the rapid stream of messages carried a mixture of sympathy, disbelief, and shock. I scrolled slowly through the comments, feeling an ache that mixed with a hesitant kind of validation, because each response confirmed that the silence I had faced from my family had not been a figment of imagination, but a real choice made with full awareness. The post had been shared hundreds of times overnight, and many people wrote that they were stunned by the idea of parents skipping their own daughter's wedding to watch a baseball game. Those comments did not feel like fuel for anger, but rather reflections of a truth I had struggled to speak aloud for years. People from around Tulsa, including individuals I had never met, expressed how painful it must have been to walk down the aisle while knowing that the people who should have cared most had willingly chosen something else. There was no cruelty in their tone. Instead, they spoke with a compassion that contrasted sharply with the dismissive messages I had received from my family the night before. As I kept reading, I noticed that acquaintances of Mom and Dad had joined the conversation. They did not attack or insult them, yet their words carried a clear sense of disappointment. Several wrote that Mom had always emphasized family values during community gatherings, and they could not comprehend how she could abandon her daughter on such an important day. Others mentioned Dad's frequent reminders at church about responsibility and commitment, questioning how those values aligned with the decision he had made. Seeing those comments felt strangely heavy, not because they shamed my parents, but because they revealed how different the outward image of my family had been from the reality I had lived. Sabrina's situation unfolded differently. A screenshot of her story at the bar during my ceremony had circulated among people who recognized the background, and the reactions she received were harsher than anything directed at Mom or Dad. Friends messaged her to ask how she could celebrate a playoff game at the exact hour, exchanged vows, and some even confronted her publicly for posting with such pride while I stood alone in the front row meant for family. I did not take pleasure in her discomfort, yet I could not ignore the fact that her own actions had made the truth undeniable to everyone who had once believed she cared. Throughout the week, consequences continued to grow in small but undeniable waves. Coworkers approached Mom at her office, asking if the story was true, and several expressed dismay that she would treat a milestone in her daughter's life as something replaceable. She apparently tried to justify her decision by repeating the same explanation she had sent to me, but the people hearing it did not seem convinced. The more she defended the choice, the more isolated she appeared among colleagues who valued family moments deeply. Dad faced similar repercussions within the church community. People who had known him for years began to distance themselves quietly, viewing his decision as inconsistent with the principles he often spoke about. He had always presented himself as someone who upheld commitments. So skipping my wedding for a recreational outing did not align with the expectations he had built for himself. According to what I heard from acquaintances online, the shift in how others viewed him was subtle yet unmistakable. By the end of the week, Sabrina had stopped posting entirely, and several friends who once appeared frequently beside her no longer interacted with her content. Her absence from social media suggested that the criticism had reached a point she could not ignore, though she never reached out to me directly. Mom, Dad, and Sabrina eventually tried to contact me with messages that sounded like attempts to rewrite the narrative surrounding their choices. They wrote that the situation had been blown out of proportion and insisted that they had not expected the post to spread so widely. Their explanations did not address the real issue. They focused on the embarrassment rather than the harm done. I read their words calmly, feeling a distance I had needed for a very long time. I chose not to respond. Remaining silent felt less like punishment and more like protection, because engaging with them would pull me back into the same pattern of minimizing my own feelings to preserve a connection that had never been mutual. The quiet that followed felt stable, steady, and entirely mine. A few months after everything that had unfolded, I began shaping a quieter and steadier life beside Ethan, without placing any hope in the idea that my family would suddenly transform into people capable of valuing me. The distance did not feel like a punishment I imposed on them, but rather a necessary space that allowed me to breathe without waiting for an apology that had never been offered. I slowly noticed how peaceful my days became when I stopped investing energy into relationships that demanded emotional labor without giving support in return. It felt as though an invisible weight had lifted, leaving room for the kind of calm that comes from reclaiming boundaries. During those early months, I devoted my attention to building the small household Ethan and I had promised to nurture together. We created simple routines that reflected a sense of partnership I had rarely witnessed growing up. He prepared coffee every morning because he knew the warmth soothed my nerves. And I organized our evening so that we always ended the day with a conversation instead of slipping into silence. Those moments, though ordinary, formed the foundation of a new kind of security that helped heal the places where old wounds had lived for so long. I realized that emotional safety did not require grand gestures, but rather a consistent presence that never made me question whether I mattered. The more I settled into this new chapter, the more I understood that family was not defined by biology or shared history, but by the people who show up when life becomes vulnerable. Ethan's friends, many of whom had once been acquaintances to me, welcomed me into their gatherings with an ease that felt unfamiliar yet deeply comforting. They asked about my work, remembered small details I had mentioned, and showed concern whenever I appeared tired. Their sincerity revealed a truth I had ignored for too many years. Love thrives in spaces where we are prioritized, not in places where we must fight for acknowledgement. As the seasons changed, I reflected on the wedding day more often than I expected. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. The empty seats no longer symbolized rejection. They represented freedom from expectations that had never aligned with the reality of who my family had been. I understood that some people cling to certain roles simply because they enjoy the appearance of being supportive without participating in the responsibilities that define those roles. Accepting this truth allowed me to release the lingering desire for reconciliation. I no longer needed them to fill positions they had abandoned long before the ceremony. There were moments when memories resurfaced abruptly, reminding me of the contrast between the past and the present. I remember childhood mornings when I competed silently for attention that drifted effortlessly toward Sabrina. I remember dinners where my accomplishments faded behind stories that highlighted someone else. Those recollections used to make me feel small. Now they serve as evidence of how far I had come. Growth does not erase pain, yet it reshapes the meaning of it. What once hurt now functioned as guidance, reminding me to protect the life I had built from falling into the same patterns. Over time, I learned that respect is the heartbeat of every meaningful relationship, and responsibility is a thread that holds families together. A bond cannot survive on titles or labels if the actions behind them contradict those roles. I discovered the importance of choosing emotional health over loyalty to people who continually disregard boundaries. Letting go of harmful connections is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of preservation that allows love to grow in spaces where it can thrive authentically. To everyone who has listened to my story until this final moment, I want to express my sincere appreciation. Your willingness to stay with me through each chapter means more than I can articulate. Sharing something so personal felt daunting, yet your presence created a space where honesty felt safe. Thank you for offering your time, your empathy, and your attention. Stories heal when they are received with understanding. As I close this journey, I invite you to share your thoughts, your experiences, or even your reflections, because your voice helps create a community where every story finds a place to belong.